Police harass black woman outside court. Then her Pentagon escort arrives. Amara Daniels braced herself on the steps of the District of Columbia Superior Court, the massive stone columns behind her as imposing as the day that lay ahead. She had come seeking closure on matters of her late father's military pension, simple paperwork. Or so she believed, yet an unsettling feeling clung to the air, prickling at her nerves. Lawyers rushed past, police officers stood watch, and onlookers lurked under the portico's shadow. All seemed normal at first glance, but something told Amara that this day was about to twist in ways she could never have foreseen. She glanced at her reflection in the courthouse's glass doors, sensing a storm about to break. Amara Daniels awoke that day with a knot lodged in her stomach. Even though the District of Columbia Superior Court was only a short taxi ride from her small apartment near Columbia Heights, she felt like she was traveling across a continent. The weight of her late father's legacy bore down on her shoulders. She'd spent months entangled in frustrating bureaucracy, all in an attempt to finalize his pension and settle outstanding benefits from the USARMY. Captain Jeremiah Daniels had served with distinction for nearly 3 decades, rising through the ranks in part due to his relentless dedication and valor, a record that included stints at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. She rode the taxi in silence, watching the cityscape blur beyond the window. Despite her usual resolve, she couldn't shake the unease creeping through her veins. The day should have been purely administrative, a brief hearing with a judge to confirm that all was in order. Nothing about it should have signaled danger. Yet a small voice inside her whispered, "Be vigilant." Upon arrival, she stood at the base of the courthouse steps. Massive pillars cast long shadows over the plaza. Flocks of attorneys hustled about, some with the distinctive hustle of overworked public defenders, others sporting suits that likely cost more than Amara's monthly rent. Court employees eyed each newcomer with casual indifference, but a pair of Metropolitan Police Department officers near the entrance caught her eye. They seemed to hold their gaze on her just a beat too long. Amara tried to ignore them, stepping into the line for security. The interior of the courthouse soared around her like a cathedral, high ceilings, marble floors that echoed every footstep, corridors bustling with tension. Clutching her slim leather briefcase containing all her father's documentation, she stepped through the metal detector. It beeped only once when her belt buckle triggered a quick wand scan from a bored security guard. As she proceeded to the assigned courtroom on the 3rd floor, a swirl of memories surfaced. The smell of her father's uniform, the clank of medals against his chest whenever he returned from ceremonies, the pride in his voice when he talked about his unit's camaraderie. The last time she had seen him alive, he told her, "Don't worry, Amara. If anything happens to me, everything is set for you." It was typical of him to plan for unforeseen events. Yet nothing could have prepared her for his sudden death from a stroke, the subsequent avalanche of paperwork, or the legal tangles that kept stalling the release of his rightful benefits. The hearing itself proved anticlimactic. Judge Regina Lopez was a brisk, no-nonsense adjudicator with an empathy that seeped through her stern exterior. After verifying Amara's identity and reviewing the stack of meticulously organized military records, the judge nodded in approval. "Miss Daniels, it appears everything is finally in order. You should receive formal confirmation within a week," she said. Her gavel tapped once, echoing in Amara's heart like a promise that her father's last wishes would be honored. Relief flooded Amara as she stepped out of the courtroom, her footsteps echoing along the hallway. All the tension that had knotted in her gut began to ease. She passed clusters of families waiting for custody hearings, men in suits preparing for criminal cases, and the occasional staff members rushing with piles of files. Feeling uncharacteristically optimistic, she made her way outside, craving the fresh air and the sense of finality she believed she had earned. Atop the courthouse steps, she paused to take one long breath, letting the midday sun warm her face. The sense of victory, though modest, felt sweet. Finally, she thought, things are going to get better. But the moment she reached the sidewalk, she noticed the same two officers from earlier. They had been watching her with an unsettling vigilance. Now, as she passed them, they started in her direction, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter with a hawk-like gaze. Her pulse stumbled. "Ma'am," the tall officer said, stepping into her path, "mind if we ask you a few questions?" A cold finger of dread ran down Amara's spine. Her day, which had just moments ago carried a sense of closure, was about to veer off track in a way she couldn't yet fathom. Amara hesitated, recalling the countless news stories she'd read or watched instances where people of color were stopped and questioned under the flimsiest of pretexts. Her father had warned her about such scenarios when she was younger. "You have rights," he'd always say. "Don't let them trample over you." With every fiber of her being, she wanted to channel his calm resolve now. "Is something wrong, officers?" she asked in a measured tone. Clutching her briefcase with both hands, she kept her posture straight. The taller officer surveyed her, eyes brimming with suspicion. "Just routine." "What were you doing in the courthouse?" Amara forced herself not to bristle. She'd done nothing wrong. "I had a legal hearing regarding my late father's military affairs." She didn't elaborate, figuring it was none of their business. The shorter officer gave a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "That's so? Seems like you were in there for a while." "I was," she answered curtly. "I'm done now, so if there's nothing else." The tall one cut her off. "We got a call about a suspicious individual loitering on courthouse grounds." "You fit the description." Her throat tightened. Fit the description. The phrase often signaled the start of a racially charged confrontation. She reminded herself to stay calm, but her mind raced. Was this a real tip, or did they simply invent it to justify the stop? "I haven't been loitering," Amara countered softly. "I was in a scheduled hearing. Mind if we see some ID?" the shorter officer asked, his gaze flicking to the briefcase in her hand. "Also, what's in that case?" Amara tensed. They had zero probable cause. "Officers, I've done nothing wrong. I just finished my hearing, and I'm heading home." The tension in the air thickened. Passers-by began slowing, sensing a brewing conflict. Some discreetly took out their phones, perhaps to record. A spark of hope flared in Amara. Maybe these cameras would dissuade the officers from escalating. Then again, she'd seen enough footage of phone-recorded encounters that ended violently despite the glaring lens of evidence. "You don't want to cooperate?" The tall officer's tone edged toward confrontation. "I'm cooperating," Amara clarified, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm simply stating that I haven't done anything to warrant a search or detainment." He moved closer, effectively blocking her path. "Look, let's do this the easy way. Hand over your ID and let us check that briefcase." Amara's heartbeat thundered in her ears. The briefcase contained all her father's documents, discharge papers, letters from the Department of Defense, and private family records. She wasn't about to let these officers rummage through them for no legitimate reason. "I'm sorry," she said, forcing her voice steady, "but that's confidential information. Unless you have probable cause or a search warrant, I decline." The shorter officer let out a derisive snort. "Got something to hide?" Amara bit her lip, resisting the anger that boiled within her. Their tone was a threat, a challenge. She glanced around at the growing circle of spectators. Some had begun filming openly now. "Let them record," she told herself. "Let the world see what's happening." "I'm not hiding anything," she replied, "but I know my rights." The tall officer's hand moved near the baton on his belt. We can bring you in for obstruction of justice." Adrenaline shot through her veins. Would they really arrest her right there, in broad daylight, for simply asserting her rights? Her father's voice echoed in her memory, calm, resolute. "Keep your composure," she silently reminded herself. Just as she feared the situation might spin out of control, a commanding voice boomed from across the plaza. "Officers, stand down." Heads turned in unison toward the source of the shout. Striding across the courthouse plaza was a woman in a neatly pressed black suit, her posture radiating authority. In her hand, she clutched a Department of Defense identification badge. Her hair was pinned into a no-nonsense bun, and everything about her demeanor screamed professional composure. "I said, stand down," she repeated, her heels clicking decisively against the concrete as she approached. "This individual is expected at a briefing with me." Both officers regarded her with evident annoyance. The shorter one folded his arms, trying to mask his unease. "Ma'am, we're just doing our—" The woman cut him off. "You're interfering with official DOD matters. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Alexis Harrington, U.S. Army, assigned to the Pentagon. And you will remove yourselves from this situation immediately." A hush fell over the onlookers. Even the pedestrians who'd been recording lowered their phones slightly, sensing they were now witnessing a different sort of power dynamic. Harrington's tone held a steel edge. She was not merely asking, but issuing a directive. The taller officer stammered, "We, received a tip about—" "You have no tip," Harrington said coolly. "And I'm quite familiar with your precinct's track record regarding unfounded stops. Either provide legitimate grounds for this detainment or back away. Now." Both officers glanced at each other, faces contorting into sullen resentment. They seemed torn between pushing their luck and risking a confrontation with someone who clearly had significant authority. The presence of cameras and the growing crowd likely weighed heavily on their minds. Without another word, the officers stepped back. A wave of relief swept over Amara, but her legs still felt shaky. Lieutenant Colonel Harrington gently took Amara by the arm, guiding her away from the scene. The gathering crowd parted to let them through, and phones resumed their filming, capturing the remarkable sight of a U.S. Army officer escorting a civilian away from a police confrontation. When they reached a black SUV parked across the street, Harrington opened the passenger door for Amara. "Please, get in. It's safer if we talk somewhere else." Amara hesitated for a brief moment, glancing at the imposing woman. Her father had taught her to be cautious, but something about Harrington's unwavering gaze felt trustworthy, almost protective. With a nod, she slid into the seat and settled her briefcase between her feet. Harrington circled to the driver's side, and soon they were merging into city traffic, leaving the courthouse and the two fuming officers behind. Once the SUV was weaving through D.C.'s bustling streets, Harrington cast her passenger a sidelong glance. "I'm sorry for that ordeal. I'm here because of your father, Captain Jeremiah Daniels. He made provisions in case you ever faced difficulties like the ones we just witnessed." Amara's mind whirled with questions. How did this stranger know her father? Why would he anticipate she might need help? She clasped her hands tightly, trying to steady her breathing. "Thank you," she managed at last, "but I'm not sure I understand how you knew to be there." Harrington's lips curved into a slight, sympathetic smile. "Your father and I served together on a special logistics project. Let's just say he saved my life once, and I'm here to pay it forward." The tension in Amara's shoulders eased a fraction, but the day's surreal turn continued. She couldn't help but wonder what exactly had happened back when her father served, that he would ensure a high-ranking officer at the Pentagon might come to her rescue. Silence filled the car for several minutes. The hum of the engine and the soft rush of the city outside offered a temporary lull. Amara stared out the window, mind reeling. She replayed the confrontation in her head, the fear, the anger, the way it had all changed when Harrington arrived. She was still trembling with residual adrenaline, but her curiosity about her father's connection to Harrington grew stronger by the second. At a stoplight near the National Mall, Harrington finally spoke again. Captain Daniels was one of the finest officers I ever worked with. He was meticulous, compassionate, and always had a backup plan for everything. Amara felt a pang in her chest. "He was a good father too," she said, voice small. "He never told me about you, though." Harrington nodded. "We operated in a space that required a certain level of confidentiality. And," she hesitated, searching for the right words, "he was protective of you. He never wanted you to worry about his more dangerous assignments." Amara frowned. "Dangerous assignments?" "Yes," Harrington affirmed, merging onto a busier thoroughfare. He participated in specialized logistics missions that weren't always straightforward supply runs. "Let's leave it at that for now. But I can promise you one thing. Your father always had your best interests at heart." A swirl of images rushed through Amara's mind, her father meticulously shining his boots, the framed medals on the living room wall, the hush in his voice when he spoke about certain deployments. As a child, she only had a vague sense that her father's job involved complexities she couldn't fully grasp. Now it appeared there was far more to his service than she ever realized. They turned onto a bridge spanning the Potomac. The looming figure of the Pentagon came into view, its unmistakable shape dominating the skyline. "Are we going to the Pentagon?" Amara asked, her heart pounding anew. "Yes," Harrington confirmed. "There are a few matters related to your father's estate we can expedite. And I need to show you some documents he wanted you to have. Consider this a courtesy from someone who owed your dad a debt." Amara's throat felt tight. She had just left the courthouse expecting closure, only to find that more doors were opening, ones she never knew existed. A part of her felt apprehensive. Another part brimmed with relief that her father's memory had powerful allies. They passed through security gates where Harrington's Department of Defense credentials fast-tracked them. Inside the enormous parking complex, Harrington led Amara to a private elevator that would bypass most public areas. Stepping into the elevator made Amara suddenly aware of how little she truly knew about this woman who had come to her rescue. "I appreciate your help," Amara said softly, "but I'm also cautious." Harrington nodded, pressing a button marked with restricted access. "I'd expect nothing less." Your father was the same way. Their eyes met for a moment in the reflective elevator doors, and Amara saw genuine respect there. She decided, tentatively, to trust this ally who had shown up when she needed it most. The Pentagon's hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, each corridor looking eerily similar with its polished floors, fluorescent lights, and neat rows of doors. Military personnel hurried about, some in uniform, others in civilian attire, but all moving with a sense of purpose. Harrington walked with brisk confidence, nodding at the occasional colleague who recognized her. Amara struggled to keep pace, her eyes darting to the myriad displays, historical photos, flags, plaques commemorating missions. She remembered her father's voice, telling her that the Pentagon was like a small city in itself. Eventually, they arrived at a corridor marked with a plaque, Army Administration Pension and Benefits Division. Harrington paused at a door and punched in a code on an electronic keypad. The door clicked open. Inside was a modest yet well-equipped office space, rows of metal filing cabinets, a few desks with computers, and shelves lined with thick binders. A middle-aged staff sergeant looked up from behind a desk. When he saw Harrington, he stood and saluted, then directed a polite smile at Amara. "Lieutenant Colonel, is this the young lady we've been expecting?" "It is," Harrington replied. "Miss Daniels, meet Staff Sergeant O'Malley. He has some documents that need your signature. so we can finalize any pending matters related to Captain Daniels's service. Amara's gaze flickered between them. I thought the court hearing would finalize everything. Harrington exhaled gently. It finalizes things on the civilian side, but sometimes the Department of Defense can streamline or accelerate certain processes. It's a favor we're extending in honor of your father's exemplary record. Amara approached the desk, heart pounding. What else could be left to finalize? She glanced at the paperwork O'Malley placed before her. Despite the neat stack, each page was dense with bureaucratic language, indemnities, allowances, designations of beneficiaries. There were also references to a special fund for families of officers who had participated in certain classified missions. Her eyes widened. "Classified missions?" she murmured. "I never knew Dad participated in anything like that." O'Malley and Harrington exchanged a knowing look. Harrington cleared her throat. Captain Daniels served in capacities that often required confidentiality. This is an additional benefit package. It's not standard for all officers, but your father earned it. You just need to sign here, here, and here. She pointed to several lines on the forms. As Amara scribbled her signature, her thoughts spun. "Dad, what did you do while I was at home, worrying about your safe return?" The realization that he had kept so many details hidden stung a bit. Yet it also made her proud he'd done important work, risked his life in ways even she couldn't fully comprehend. His final act of securing her future felt monumental. Once the documents were signed, O'Malley carefully organized them into a folder. "We'll push these through," he said, "and you should see a resolution in about 7 business days. Any accrued funds will be transferred to the account you provided at the hearing." Amara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you. I appreciate everything." Harrington nodded. "I also have something personal for you. Let's step into a private conference room." She led Amara down the hall, stopping at a small room with a long table and an American flag in the corner. Inside, Harrington opened a locked cabinet and withdrew a slim leather-bound journal. "This was your father's," she said gently, handing the journal to Amara. "He used it during his final tour in an undisclosed location. He left instructions that it should go to you once certain matters were settled." Amara's hands trembled as she accepted the journal. On the cover, her father's initials J.D. were embossed in gold. She stared at the cover for a long moment, feeling an almost reverential awe. "He never told me about this journal." "I don't know what's inside," Harrington continued. "He was a private man, but he made it clear that this belonged to you." Overwhelmed, Amara nodded, quietly thanking Harrington. As she clutched the journal to her chest, an avalanche of emotions surged. Gratitude that her father was still guiding her in some way, sadness that he was gone, and a flicker of anger at the unjust harassment she'd faced outside the courthouse. "Lieutenant Colonel," Amara asked softly, "why did you step in earlier today?" Harrington's gaze softened. "I owed your father a great debt. He once saved me from an ambush during a mission overseas. He literally dragged me to safety when I was hit by shrapnel. After that, he made me promise one thing: if anything ever happened to him, I'd make sure his daughter never fought alone against injustice." It was almost too much for Amara to take in. Her father's bravery, his forethought, Harrington's loyalty, it all collided in her chest. For a moment, she couldn't speak, simply gripping the journal as though it were a lifeline to the father she missed every single day. "Thank you," she said at last, blinking back tears. "Thank you for honoring that promise." Harrington inclined her head. "Your father was an exceptional man, but there's more you need to know." The hush of the conference room pressed in. Harrington took a seat at the table, gesturing for Amara to join her. Settling into the chair, Amara sensed a deeper conversation coming, one that extended far beyond official documents and pension benefits. In his later years, Harrington began, "Your father grew increasingly concerned about discrimination and bias in both civilian and military spheres. He experienced it in subtle ways, sometimes overt ways, and he worried about you especially if you ever encountered the sort of harassment you face today." Amara nodded, tears threatening to spill. "He raised me to be cautious. I always thought he was just being overprotective." Harrington's expression grew serious. Over the last decade, he and a group of like-minded African-American officers formed an unofficial support network. They'd been looking out for each other for years, sharing resources, helping with promotions, and fighting back against systemic injustice when they encountered it. A wave of gratitude washed over Amara. She envisioned her father connecting with others, forging a protective circle that transcended typical military bonds. He really thought of everything, didn't he? A sad smile tugged at Harrington's lips. That was your dad. He had a contingency plan for every scenario, no matter how unlikely, including the possibility that local law enforcement might overstep their authority when you walked out of a courthouse. Amara briefly closed her eyes, remembering the intense fear she'd felt when the officers cornered her. "So you part of that network too?" Harrington nodded. "Yes, and there are others. We agreed to keep an eye on your situation after your father's passing, especially once we learned about the delays with the pension. The moment those officers started harassing you, I received a text notification from a friend who monitors the area. I dropped everything and came." Her words wrapped Amara in a cocoon of safety. She realized that her father's influence extended far beyond the grave. Yet the memory of those officers made her jaw tighten. "They still tried to search me. They threatened to arrest me." "What if you hadn't come?" Harrington's jaw tensed. "You shouldn't have had to deal with that fear alone. That's why I want you to know you have options. If you want to file a formal complaint, we can connect you with legal resources. There's a reason those officers back down so fast. They know they have no ground to stand on, and they fear a higher authority shining a light on their actions." Amara's heart hammered. She considered the possibility of filing a complaint. Part of her wanted to move on, leave the incident behind, and focus on mourning her father properly. But another part seethed with righteous anger. "They shouldn't get away with treating people like that," she muttered. Harrington placed a hand on Amara's arm. "Exactly. And we can help you, but the choice is yours. You're the one who went through this." She exhaled, looking down at the journal still clutched in her hands. Her father had endured discrimination in the army, and yet he persevered, eventually creating a network that would protect others. Wasn't it her responsibility to continue that legacy? She thought of the countless individuals who lacked a powerful ally to step in. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll file a complaint." Harrington's features reflected approval. "Then let's see to it that justice is served." Leaving the Pentagon later that afternoon, Amara found herself enveloped by a crisp breeze as she walked toward the metro station. Harrington had offered to drive her home, but Amara chose to navigate the city on her own. She needed space to think, to absorb all that had transpired. Her reflection flickered in the polished surfaces of the station's escalators, reminding her she was a changed person, someone who understood her father's life and legacy in an entirely new way. That evening, she sat in her small living room, the overhead lamp casting a warm glow as she flipped through her father's journal. Many pages were filled with operational notes times, dates, cryptic references to supply routes. Some entries highlighted camaraderie, jokes shared with fellow soldiers, small acts of kindness witnessed during dire situations. Yet sprinkled among them were also raw, personal reflections, frustration at facing prejudice from higher-ups, heartbreak over losing soldiers in the line of duty, and unwavering love for his daughter. One entry in particular caught her eye. "I worry for Amara, especially now. Today I witnessed a soldier in my unit belittled because of his skin color. That soldier reminded me of how vulnerable we are once we step outside the uniform. What if she experiences this in the civilian world, with no rank on her collar to shield her? God, I hope the plans I've made will protect her when she needs it. Tears blurred her vision. You did protect me, Dad, she thought. You had friends in high places, and they came for me. She closed the journal gently, hugging it to her chest. The next morning, she reached out to a pro bono civil rights attorney recommended by Harrington. It took several days of back and forth to arrange the paperwork, but eventually, the formal complaint was filed against the two Metropolitan Police Department officers for racial profiling and harassment. The attorney advised her that these cases often took months, sometimes years to resolve, and outcomes could be uncertain. Still, Amara pressed on, motivated by the memory of her father's convictions. She had no illusions about changing the entire system overnight, but perhaps shedding light on this injustice would be a small step, or at the very least, it would hold those particular officers accountable. In the weeks that followed, her everyday life shifted. She sensed a mixture of fear and empowerment. Fear, because she worried about retaliation. Empowerment, because she was no longer alone. The support network her father helped create rallied behind her in subtle ways. Harrington stayed in touch, occasionally checking in to ensure Amara felt safe. Another officer from the network, a major stationed at Fort Belvoir, sent an encouraging email, reminding her that her father's friends stood ready to help if she felt threatened. The local press got wind of the complaint too. A few reporters reached out, but Amara declined interviews for now, preferring not to turn her life into public spectacle. At least not yet, she told herself. Let's see how the department responds. Meanwhile, the memory of that confrontation outside the courthouse gnawed at her. Every time she passed a police officer, she felt a slight jolt, a reminder that the uniform could be a source of protection or danger, depending on who wore it. The swirl of emotions left her restless at night, flipping through her father's journal, gleaning solace from his words. One afternoon, an envelope arrived from the Metropolitan Police Department. Inside was a terse acknowledgement. Internal Affairs would launch an investigation, and she might be called to give testimony. There was no promise of any outcome, just a statement of procedure. Still, it was a start. A month later, Amara received the summons. She was requested to appear as a witness in an internal police disciplinary hearing. The hearing was to determine if enough evidence existed to formally charge the two officers with misconduct. She felt a cold sweat break out when she read the letter, but her lawyer assured her this was a crucial step. The day of the hearing dawned grey and drizzly. Amara arrived at the Metropolitan Police Department's administrative building, her heart hammering. Harrington had arranged for another member of the network, Major Helena Brooks, to accompany her for moral support. Major Brooks was an imposing figure, tall, poised, with eyes that burned bright with intelligence. Her presence felt like an emotional fortress, and Amara was grateful. Inside, a stark, fluorescent-lit conference room, a panel of 3 department officials awaited. The 2 accused officers were there as well, each flanked by legal counsel. Amara forced herself not to flinch under their baleful glares. She took her seat, hands folded in her lap. The lead official, a middle-aged man with a graying mustache, initiated the proceedings. Amara was asked to recount her story in detail. She spoke steadily, recalling each statement and gesture from the officers. When she described their aggression and the way they demanded to see her briefcase without probable cause, her stomach churned at the memory. Still, she kept her voice firm. Her attorney presented additional evidence, cell phone videos from bystanders at the scene, along with footage from courthouse security cameras. The videos left little room for alternative interpretations. Amara had been calm, while the officers had displayed overt hostility. One officer was seen resting a hand on his holster. The other had positioned himself to block her path. The officers' counsel tried to poke holes in her testimony, suggesting she was combative and uncooperative. Each time, her lawyer or the panel's clarifying questions revealed how baseless those claims were. Yes, she had refused a search, but only because the officers provided no legitimate reason. Yes, she had chosen not to give them her ID, also because they cited no cause. The panel seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the officer's narrative. Finally, the taller officer took the stand. He claimed they'd received an anonymous tip about someone carrying contraband, yet he produced no written record, nor any dispatch call logs backing up that claim. The panel members exchanged looks that conveyed skepticism. When the shorter officer spoke, he accused Amara of exaggerating the threat. But the panel had already witnessed the video. Nothing he said could dispel the damning footage, which showed him leaning threateningly toward Amara, ignoring her questions about probable cause. The hearing ended with a promise that a decision would be made soon regarding formal disciplinary action. As Amara left the building, she felt light-headed, part relief, part lingering dread. Would this truly lead to accountability, or would the system protect its own? Major Brooks placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. They have no ground to stand on. This isn't going away quietly. Amara gazed up at the rain clouds through the window. I hope so. I really do. Days trickled by, then weeks. Amara poured herself into a local literacy program she volunteered with, trying to distract her mind from the pending decision. In those quiet moments of reading children's books to wide-eyed kids, she found respite from the tumult of legal battles and hidden military legacies. Harrington called periodically, checking on her. Each conversation was a reminder that she wasn't alone, that her father's circle of friends stood vigilant. Sometimes, Amara wondered how she'd functioned before discovering this support network existed. The sense of solidarity buoyed her during the hardest nights, when nightmares of that day on the courthouse steps jolted her awake. Finally, an official letter arrived at her apartment. She tore it open with trembling hands. The Metropolitan Police Department's crest topped the page, and beneath it, a verdict on the disciplinary hearing. Both officers had been found liable for misconduct, including racial profiling and harassment. Internal Affairs recommended the taller officer be terminated from the force. The shorter one was to be suspended without pay for 6 months, followed by a probationary period with mandatory retraining. Tears sprang to Amara's eyes. She read the words, hardly believing it. A sense of relief, vindication, and overwhelming gratitude rushed through her in equal measure. They did it. Someone finally held them accountable. She dialed Harrington's number first. The line rang twice before the calm, measured voice of the lieutenant colonel greeted her. Harrington speaking. They're firing one, and the other is suspended. Amara managed through a shaky laugh. I can't believe it's actually happening. Harrington's tone reflected genuine warmth. That's wonderful news. I'm proud of you for standing your ground. In that moment, the gravity of it all hit Amara like a wave. She thought of the countless people who never saw justice, who got lost in the system or were too afraid to come forward. Perhaps this is just one small victory, she told herself, but at least it's a victory that might encourage someone else. That evening, she sat in her apartment, flipping through the final pages of her father's journal. She found an entry dated shortly before he passed, referencing the chain of good deeds, how one act of bravery or kindness can ripple through many lives. He concluded with a line that made Amara's breath catch. I trust my daughter to continue the chain if I'm no longer here. She traced the letters with her fingertips. I will, Dad, I promise. Word of Amara's victory spread through local activist circles. Community leaders invited her to speak about her experience standing up against police harassment. At first, she hesitated. She was no activist. She was just a woman who refused to let injustice slide. But Harrington and others in the network encouraged her, saying her story could empower countless voices that often went unheard. She started small, speaking at a church meeting in Anacostia. Nervous but determined, she recounted how the confrontation outside the courthouse had left her feeling powerless until help arrived in the form of a sworn ally from the Pentagon. She emphasized her father's role, how his service and foresight had paved the way for her to receive such support. By the end of her talk, people cheered, many teary-eyed with gratitude. Before long, local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a rare instance where a black civilian successfully challenged police misconduct and won. Amara fielded calls from civil rights organizations, some wanting her to become a spokesperson for their campaigns. She maintained a careful balance, reminding them she had her own life, her own plans. Yet she offered to share her story whenever it might help further accountability. In the midst of all this, Harrington arranged a small get-together at Fort Myer, a military installation adjacent to Arlington National Cemetery. When Amara arrived, she found a modest gathering of African-American service members, some of whom had served under her father. They greeted her warmly, sharing anecdotes about Captain Jeremiah Daniels, how he once orchestrated a safe passage for refugees in a conflict zone, how he mentored younger soldiers to rise in the ranks, how he braved discrimination with unwavering grace. Toward the evening's end, they presented her with a plaque bearing her father's name, citing his dedication to equality and justice. Tears streamed down her face as she accepted it, each drop a mixture of pride and grief. She felt closer to her father than she had in years, surrounded by people who honored him not just for his official rank, but for the compassion he embodied. Her father's journal was tucked safely in her purse. She planned to read a final excerpt to the group as a gesture of shared remembrance. Searching for a fitting passage, she landed on one that read, "No soldier stands alone. We stand as one, or we don't stand at all." It struck her how relevant these words were, not only to military life, but to her own trials. She read the excerpt aloud, voice trembling with emotion. When she finished, the room fell silent. Then came warm applause. Harrington stepped forward, face glowing with pride. "Your father's spirit lives on in you," she said. "We saw that the day you refused to bow under pressure on those courthouse steps." Amara exhaled, releasing a final wave of tension she'd carried for months. She grasped Harrington's hand, and in that simple gesture, she felt the unspoken promise to uphold the values her father championed, to keep pushing against injustices, and to extend a hand of support whenever someone else found themselves cornered. Time passed, and life found a new rhythm. The legal fallout from the disciplinary hearing rippled through the Metropolitan Police Department. The terminated officer appealed the decision, but the ruling stood. The suspended officer underwent a mandatory training program focusing on racial bias. Local activists cited Amara's case as a pivotal example of holding officers accountable. Meanwhile, the final disbursement of Captain Daniels's pension arrived in her bank account, along with the classified mission bonus that Harrington had arranged. Amara used some of the funds to support her mother, who lived in a quieter part of Maryland. She donated a portion to a veterans advocacy group that her father had once admired. She felt his presence at each turn, guiding her choices, reminding her that the fruits of justice are meant to be shared. With her father's affairs settled and her complaint resolved, Amara realized she stood at a crossroads. She could return to her once quiet life, or she could continue to grow into the role that circumstances and her father's legacy had carved out for her. Every so often, she'd re-watch the footage from that fateful day, seeing herself tense and terrified, then glimpsing Harrington's decisive entry. It reminded her of how precarious the line between despair and hope can be. Eventually, she decided to go public with her story in a more formal capacity. She granted an interview to a local newspaper, the Washington City paper, detailing her father's background, the harassment incident, and the subsequent victory. The piece sparked discussions in the city council about stricter oversight of police procedures. While some corners criticized her for attacking law enforcement, she also received an outpouring of gratitude from people who felt emboldened to share their own stories. Even the judge who had overseen her father's pension hearing, Honorable Regina Lopez, took note. She extended an invitation for Amara to speak at a courthouse seminar focused on community relations with law enforcement. Standing at a podium in the same building where her ordeal began, Amara addressed a mixed audience of judges, lawyers, police representatives, and local residents. She recounted the fear she felt that day and how swiftly it dissolved into hope when an ally stepped forward. Accountability, Amara said into the microphone, her voice echoing through the ornate courtroom, is the cornerstone of justice. My father taught me that. He fought for his country and for the values it was supposed to stand for. When we hold each other accountable, we move a step closer to the promise of equality we claim to cherish. Thunderous applause followed. In that moment, as she gazed over the audience, she recognized the ripple effect her actions had triggered, how her father's careful planning and her own choice to stand firm had forged a path others could follow. Some weeks later, Amara found herself once again on the courthouse steps, but this time she was there by choice, not compulsion. She stood at the very spot where the confrontation had taken place. The morning sun illuminated the marble columns, and for a moment she could almost see a ghostly replay, herself, frightened, confronted by hostile officers. Then Harrington's voice cutting through the tension, deflecting danger with a single command. The steps were empty now, save for a few passers-by entering and exiting. In the distance, she heard the hum of traffic on Constitution Avenue. The city felt different, yet also the same, alive with possibilities, weighed down by histories of injustice, but also brimming with potential for reform. Footsteps approached from behind. She turned to find Lieutenant Colonel Harrington, impeccably dressed in uniform, stepping up beside her. "I was at a meeting nearby," Harrington said with a smile, "and I figured I'd check on you." Amara returned the smile. "I'm good. Just reminiscing." Harrington glanced around. "It's a powerful place. You came face to face with injustice, but you found strength. Your father's plan worked." Amara nodded. "Yeah, it did." She gazed down the stairs, remembering the swirling emotions, the pounding in her chest. "But what happens next?" "That's up to you," Harrington replied. "You've already made an impact by speaking out. You've helped set a precedent. If you ever want to do more, the network is here to support you. We can't solve everything overnight, but every stand we take matters." They stood side by side for a while, the sun edging higher in the sky. Amara thought of her father's journal, the final entry she'd read that very morning. "We do what's right, even when the world tells us to stay quiet. We stand together, not just as soldiers, but as people committed to a higher moral code." With a sense of solemn pride, she realized that, although her father's physical presence was gone, his influence was more alive than ever. She felt it in every supportive hand that had guided her, every word of encouragement, and every flash of courage that had allowed her to say no to intimidation. Harrington checked her watch. "I have to get back. Pentagon life never slows down," she said with a soft chuckle. Then she placed a gentle hand on Amara's shoulder. "Take care of yourself. And remember, you're never alone in this fight." Amara watched her descend the steps. She whispered a goodbye, not just to the formidable officer, but to the fear that had gripped her on these very stones months before. Then she turned and stepped into the city, determined to carry forward the legacy of a father who believed in justice so fervently that he planned for it, fought for it, and ensured that she would never have to face adversity without a powerful friend by her side. In the end, one person's courage and one officer's promise converged to create a story that speaks to everyone who's ever felt powerless against a broken system. Amara Daniels faced blatant harassment on the very steps of justice, yet the legacy her father left behind became a lifeline. When Lieutenant Colonel Harrington arrived, that lifeline tightened into an unbreakable bond. What happened next wasn't just about one woman's quest for accountability. It became a clarion call for anyone yearning for fairness and reform. Sometimes standing up is daunting, but as this story reveals, it can also ignite transformation far beyond a single courthouse. If you found hope or inspiration in Amara's journey, please hit the like button, share this video widely, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of change. Together, let's keep shining light into the darkest corners and step forward with renewed faith in each other.